Welcome to Histology.
Tell me about the man of many turns, who many ways wandered when he had sacked Troy's holy citadel. This is how Homer began his story of the hero Odysseus, a brave warrior whose cleverness helped the Greeks breach Troy's divine walls. Of all the heroes who survived the war's destruction, Odysseus was the only one who hadn't returned home yet. On Mount Olympus, the gods gathered in an assembly. Zeus, seated high on his throne, remarked on how humans blame all their troubles on the gods, when in reality, most of their misfortune stemmed from their own choices and foolishness, for which they paid the price. At this point, Athena interjected, asking why Odysseus, the wise king of Ithaca, despite being God-fearing, continued to suffer far from his beloved homeland. The goddess lamented the hero's plight. He had been stranded for 7 years on the island of Ogygia. There, the beautiful nymph Calypso, daughter of Atlas, held him on her island because she desired him as her husband. Zeus explained that he wasn't responsible for Odysseus' delayed return. Rather, Poseidon harbored hatred for the hero ever since Odysseus blinded the god's son. However, at that moment, Poseidon was in far-off Ethiopia, where he was being worshipped, and thus did not participate in the assembly. With the council of gods' approval, Zeus decreed that Odysseus had the right to return home. Zeus's favorite daughter was pleased, stating that she would go to Ithaca to find Telemachus, Odysseus' son. Zeus ordered Hermes, the messenger god, to go to Ogygia and command Calypso to free Odysseus. Hermes put on his winged sandals and set off to fulfill the god's wishes. The island of Ogygia lay at the navel of the sea. It was a place where lush vegetation grew and a gentle breeze blew, yet strong waves crashed against its coastline. There, Calypso tried every way to persuade Odysseus to stay with her, even offering him immortality. But Odysseus knew he was merely mortal. He believed it was wrong to desire immortality, as his place was not among the gods, but beside his family. Hermes entered Calypso's cave, received by the nymph with great reverence. The divine messenger informed Calypso that, by Zeus's order, she was to free Odysseus and provide the necessary means for his journey. The nymph was enraged, claiming the Olympian gods were envious, displeased with the happiness of lesser deities when they formed relationships with mortals. Yet Calypso knew she could do nothing against Zeus's will. Sometimes her heart broke when Odysseus cried and sighed with homesickness. After delivering the message, Hermes left, and a saddened Calypso went to meet Odysseus. As usual, Odysseus was by the sea, thinking of his beloved Penelope. Calypso told him to stop crying, for he could finally return home. Odysseus, surprised and skeptical, looked back suspiciously, telling the nymph he could stay if that was her will. The nymph laughed at Odysseus, who, though he wanted to return home more than anything, knew better than to anger a deity. She assured him she spoke the truth. His time on Ogygia was ending. Calypso showed Odysseus where to find materials to build a raft and explained the boat's design so it could withstand the waves. Odysseus followed all her instructions, and eventually the transport that would help him reach his home was ready. The nymph gave Odysseus supplies for the journey, telling him that if he knew the dangers still awaiting him, he would have chosen to stay. But the king of Ithaca would not waste that opportunity. Odysseus and Calypso said goodbye, and with the help of favorable winds brought by Calypso, Odysseus set off toward his destination. In his precarious vessel, Odysseus bravely navigated the vast sea that separated European from African peoples. His goal was to return to his beloved wife Penelope's arms and reunite with his young son Telemachus. On the island of Ithaca, the fearless hero's kingdom was in peril, as years had passed since the king left for the Trojan War. Almost everyone believed Odysseus had died on his venture. Odysseus's palace was filled with suitors who wished to marry Penelope and seize the vacant throne. The queen was no longer young, but still possessed incredible beauty. Young Telemachus, a baby when his father left, was now a man. The suitors chose to stay in the palace, squandering Odysseus's fortune while waiting for Penelope to choose her new husband. Athena took the form of a seemingly noble man. In disguise, she entered the palace past the suitors, who eyed the visitor with suspicion. Telemachus received the visitor with hospitality, just as Zeus had commanded men. The man said his name was Mentes, king of the Taphians, allies of Telemachus's father. Telemachus told the visitor about the chaos in his father's kingdom and how the suitors were depleting his inheritance. Finally, he asked if the visitor had any news of Odysseus. Mentes said he didn't know Odysseus's exact location, but he was alive and doing everything to return home. The nobleman said Telemachus should try to find clues to his father's whereabouts, for he was now a man and should take control of his destiny. Telemachus felt great courage in his heart. Mentes transformed into a bird and flew away. Witnessing that scene, the young man was certain the gods were on his side. With the firmness and courage the goddess instilled, Telemachus announced to the suitors that the next day he would organize an assembly to decide the fate of his father's kingdom. Penelope realized something had changed in her son. He was no longer a boy, and this filled her with pride. The next day, all the men of Ithaca gathered at the assembly Telemachus called. The young man spoke about the chaos in his father's kingdom and chastised the suitors for depleting the missing hero's fortune. Antinous, one of the most arrogant suitors, interrupted Telemachus, saying the blame for the situation lay with Penelope, who had deceived them. Penelope had promised the suitors that as soon as she finished the shroud she was weaving for Laertes, Odysseus's father, she would choose her new husband. During the day, she would weave the shroud for her father-in-law, but as night fell, she would undo the morning's work. Thus, for almost 4 years, she deceived the suitors until her trickery was discovered. The suitors claimed they would hold consecutive banquets in Odysseus's palace until Penelope chose her new husband, even if it exhausted Telemachus's entire inheritance. Telemachus threatened his rivals, warning that because of this insult to hospitality, Zeus would ruin the suitors. 2 eagles suddenly began a flight in the skies, an omen of something important. The soothsayer Halitherses interpreted the omen and told the suitors that the king was returning, and the fate of his opponents would be terrible. Eurymachus, another prominent suitor, ignored the elders' words and said that as soon as the assembly was over, they would again enjoy Odysseus's possessions, for they believed he was dead. Telemachus revealed the real reason for the assembly. He needed help to get a boat, men, and supplies for a trip to Pylos in Sparta, where he would try to find clues to his father's whereabouts among the comrades who fought alongside him at Troy. If unsuccessful, he would let his mother choose a suitor. No one supported Telemachus's idea. Therefore, Mentor, the man Odysseus entrusted with his family's care, scolded the people of Ithaca for showing such ingratitude to the king's family, who was always kind and generous to them. The assembly was dissolved, and Telemachus did not achieve his goal. At the seaside, Telemachus prayed to the goddess Athena for help. She quickly answered. Athena assumed Mentor's form and assured the young man she would provide the necessary means for his journey, for she perceived the prince had his father's courage. Obeying Mentor's directions, Telemachus asked the old servant Euryclea for help gathering supplies for the journey. Meanwhile, the goddess induced a deep sleep in the suitors so Telemachus could escape unnoticed. Telemachus boarded the ship the disguised goddess had provided. Like his father, he set off bravely, leaving Ithaca behind to face the dangers and obstacles between him and his goal. After years trapped on Calypso's island, Odysseus, guided by the stars, sailed his ship back toward Ithaca. But Odysseus would not sail unpunished through Poseidon's realm, who still harbored much resentment for the hero, having not been at the divine assembly that ordered the king of Ithaca's return. The god would unleash his wrath upon him. The sea grew rough, and Odysseus had to use all his sailing skills to fight the waves. The terrible ordeal Poseidon imposed on Odysseus made him envious of the heroes who died at Troy's gates. If he had fallen there, he would be exalted among men and not face the inglorious death awaiting him. A great wave capsized his boat, throwing Odysseus into the water. In the churning waters, he struggled to emerge, but everything indicated this would be his end. He was about to give up when a female figure appeared, and his will to live was renewed. Odysseus rose to the surface, managing to fill his lungs with air while spitting out the salty water he had swallowed. He managed to cling to the remains of his ship, which had been destroyed by the waves, and over the wreckage, he saw a beautiful woman who could only be a goddess. The sea goddess was Ino, a deity who had once been mortal. Therefore, she was very empathetic to human suffering. She asked Odysseus to remove his robes, which made swimming more difficult. While offering her veil to Odysseus, Ino assured him that it would help him reach dry land safely. Odysseus tied the veil to his chest as the goddess commanded and swam toward the Phaeacian shore. Poseidon was pleased. That man had already suffered too many torments in recent years. It was time to allow the counsel of the gods to be carried out. Poseidon would no longer pursue the king of Ithaca. Odysseus used all his strength to reach the beach and almost perished when he was thrown by the sea against the rocks. But at last, he was safe on hospitable land. His first action on dry land was to return the veil of the goddess Ino to the sea, she who saved him from certain death. The hero slept on a bed of leaves in the forest to regain his energy before seeking help in the unknown land. The next morning, he awoke to the sound of female voices that seemed to be enjoying themselves. Among the trees, Odysseus saw a group of girls playing with a ball. Among them, one young woman stood out. The hero realized she was a noble figure among the other young women, and that this noble woman would probably tell him what place that was. But his nakedness was an obstacle. Odysseus approached the young girls, using a branch with leaves to hide himself. The girls were startled by the sight, except for the noble and beautiful young woman. Odysseus knelt before the girl and said, "I don't know if you are a goddess or a mortal. If you are a goddess, you seem to me to be Artemis, who stands out for her poise and beauty among the most beautiful nymphs in her retinue. If you are mortal, thrice blessed are your parents to birth a daughter who blossoms so splendidly." Flattered, the young woman said her name was Nausicaa and decided to help the man, telling her servants to give Odysseus robes. Clean and dressed in a beautiful robe, Odysseus looked like a different man, unlike the castaway the youngsters had found. Nausicaa was captivated by that elegant and seductive man. She wanted to introduce him to her father, King Alcinous of the Phaeacians, considering the possibility of him becoming her future husband. The princess pointed Odysseus the way to the city of the Phaeacians, but did not accompany him, for it would not be proper for her to appear with a man in the city. At the city's entrance gates, Odysseus prayed that the gods would protect him and not let another barbarian people keep him from his goal. With Athena's protection, the hero was able to make his way to the palace without being harassed for being a foreigner. Upon reaching the palace, he knelt before Queen Arete, asking for assistance in returning home. Touched, the queen asked the king to receive the visitor with all hospitality as required by Zeus. The king decided to offer all his hospitality. Odysseus was given a bed, and the next day great festivities were organized in honor of the gods. Athletic games were held to demonstrate the Phaeacian skill and strength. Odysseus even showed his strength by throwing a discus. During the banquet held to honor the guest, a bard sang of the Greeks' achievements in the Trojan War. Odysseus listened to the poet with admiration, for he was certainly inspired by the Muses. He sang the deeds of the heroes in such detail that he seemed to have been there. Odysseus wept, remembering the war that had kept him away for so long from his beloved land and family. King Alcinous, who until then had not known his guest, was one of the heroes of the deeds sung by the bard, asked why those stories moved him so much. Odysseus said he would explain everything to the king, but he didn't even know where to start. The hero took a deep breath and finally revealed his identity. He said he was Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, who for 10 years had fought alongside the bravest men before Troy's great walls. Everyone was astonished at the revelation. Odysseus said he would tell his hosts about the adventures and hardships that caused him much pain. It all started after he and his men left Troy behind. This is how Odysseus's adventures began. After 10 years of war, thanks to Odysseus's wit, the city of Troy had finally been captured and plundered. The king of Ithaca and his men, after years of fighting before Troy's walls, were ready to return home. Odysseus and his squadron of 12 ships were sailing alongside the squadron of the great hero Agamemnon until they were separated by a great storm. The storm blew Odysseus's men off course, taking them close to the land of the Cyclades. These people allied themselves with the Trojans during the war, being responsible for the deaths of many Greeks. His crew demanded revenge against their enemies. In a surprise attack, Odysseus and his men pillaged the city of Ismarus, killing the warriors who resisted and enslaving those who did not flee. But the Ithacans' invasion of the island would not go unpunished. The men and women who fled the city ran to neighboring towns and cities in search of reinforcements. Meanwhile, Odysseus tried in vain to get his men to return to the ships, but they were determined to celebrate the newly won spoils. That's when one of the lookouts warned that an army was approaching. Odysseus's battalion had over 100 experienced warriors with several years of fighting in Troy. They were not afraid to fight. The battle began, and Odysseus felt foolish to be fighting again in an unnecessary conflict even after achieving ultimate glory in Troy. The Ithacans fought like lions against more numerous enemies, but the countless number of Ciconian warriors made victory impossible. Odysseus ordered a retreat, and his men fled to their ships. The ships quickly departed the Ciconies' lands, and each ship lost 6 brave warriors in vain. But the hero's adversities had only just begun. A strong wind tore the ship's sails, leaving his vessels at the mercy of the sea currents. His men worked at mending the sails, wanting to find their way home as quickly as possible. With the sails already mended, they found an unknown island, heading for it to supply the ships with drinking water. On land, Odysseus ordered 3 of his men to scour the island to find out who the resident people were. The ships were already stocked, and the scouts had yet to return. Odysseus then led a search party. The hero was unaware that his men had been welcomed by the natives and were offered exotic food. They had been given lotus flowers and fruits. When Odysseus met them, they were eating the lotus fruit with great satisfaction. A compatriot greeted him as if he were a stranger and gave him the exotic fruit. Odysseus looked suspiciously at the fruit, which looked quite appetizing. The man who had lived with his king for the past 10 years seemed not to recognize him, and Odysseus realized this could only be caused by some toxin in the fruit. The king of Ithaca tried to convince the men to return with him to the ships, but they wished to stay there eating lotus for the rest of their lives. Odysseus ordered his men to forcibly drag their colleagues back to the ships while they begged to stay. These men were tied up and put back on the ships. The squadron departed, leaving the island of the Lotus Eaters behind while its lotus-eating inhabitants waved before eating the fruit that would make them forget about those visitors. Meanwhile, one of Odysseus's men was crying, for he wished only to eat the lotus fruit to forget all the horrors he had witnessed in the war. But Odysseus's men would encounter even more terrible images during their return home. Odysseus and his men spent several days without seeing solid ground in their heroic attempt to return home when they finally found an island on the horizon. It was the famous island of the Cyclopes, one-eyed creatures, sons of Poseidon, the mighty god of the seas. Odysseus wanted to meet the island's inhabitants and chose 12 of his best men to explore the island with him. They found a large cave, and the sound of bleating sheep could be heard from inside. Upon entering the cave, Odysseus realized this was the home of one of the beings who inhabited the island. Inside the cave, there was an enclosure with sheep, vessels filled with goat's milk, and bowls with fresh cheese made from it. Odysseus tasted some of the cheese and considered stealing it, but decided to wait for the cave dweller's return and negotiate with him. The hero would regret this decision. The huge Cyclops appeared in front of the cave, bringing with him part of his herd that he had taken out to graze. Odysseus and his men hid, fearing for their lives. But the sailors' hiding places were revealed when the Cyclops lit a fire in the center of the cave. Odysseus came out of his hiding place and introduced himself to the monster, stating who he was and what he was doing there, asking for hospitality. The Cyclops said his name was Polyphemus, the most glorious of his race. He claimed he owed no hospitality to inferior beings, for he did not recognize human laws. Polyphemus grabbed 2 of Odysseus's men by the legs and slammed them to the ground, killing them instantly. As if this weren't enough, the beast devoured them completely. The mighty Cyclops moved a huge stone and blocked the cave's exit. After that gruesome meal, the Cyclops decided to sleep. Odysseus's men wanted to kill him while he slept, But the cunning leader stopped them because it would be impossible to move the heavy stone blocking the cave exit. The next day, the giant took his sheep out to pasture, leaving the men locked in the cave. Odysseus, with his men, planned a way to avenge their colleagues' deaths. They found a large log of wood and sharpened one end. At the end of the day, the Cyclops returned and, after re-entering, closed the cave's exit. Odysseus poured into a jar the wine from all his men's wineskins to offer it to the one-eyed giant. Polyphemus drank the strong wine offered by Odysseus with satisfaction and liked the gesture. He told the hero that as a reward, he would be the last to be devoured and asked Odysseus his name. He replied that his name was Nobody and that everyone knew him that way. Drunken Polyphemus felt an irresistible urge to sleep. Odysseus and his men took the makeshift weapon and prepared their revenge. They ran with the sharp stake toward the monster's one eye. The Cyclops woke up and screamed in pain. After hearing his brother's terrible screams, 2 other Cyclopes appeared at the cave's entrance. They asked who had done it, and Polyphemus shouted, "Nobody! Nobody has pierced my eye." Since there was no one to punish, they returned to their homes. The next day, the blind Cyclops let the animals out to graze, but he did not expect Odysseus to use another trick. Clinging to the bellies of the strong rams, Odysseus and his men managed to escape Polyphemus's cave. When they were all out of the cave, they quickly ran to the ships. On the ship, Odysseus shouted at the monster, saying that being blinded was a deserved punishment for a criminal who disregarded Zeus's designs by devouring those who had asked for hospitality. Polyphemus pulled a large chunk from a mountain and threw it in the direction of Odysseus's cries. The great rock fell near the king of Ithaca's ship. His men begged him to stop taunting the beast, but Odysseus continued. He shouted again, saying that when someone asked him who had pierced his eye, he should answer that it was the man who devastated the city of Troy, son of Laertes, the great Odysseus, the king of Ithaca. The furious Polyphemus threw another boulder at Odysseus's ship, and it grazed the Greek ship. Odysseus sailed away from the Cyclops island, regretting that he had lost some men, but excited that he had overcome a huge challenge. Polyphemus asked his divine father and begged Poseidon to punish the man responsible for blinding his son. He asked that the god of the seas prevent Odysseus from returning home. If the god so willed, he should wander the seas for years, arriving home without ship, treasure, or companions. Odysseus's arrogance, which led him to mock Poseidon's son, would cost him dearly, for he now had the god of the seas as an enemy. Days after leaving the Cyclops island, Odysseus's fleet found a floating island that was not attached to land. There was only a splendid bronze palace on top of a hill. The king of Ithaca and his men disembarked on the island, heading toward the island's inhabitants. Odysseus met Aeolus, the guardian of the winds, who cordially welcomed the visitors. During the banquet in honor of their illustrious visitors, Aeolus and his sons listened cheerfully to Odysseus, who narrated to them the great deeds of the heroes during the Trojan War. To thank them for the entertainment, Aeolus opened a large wineskin and placed inside it all the winds except for Zephyr, which would blow quietly to guide Odysseus and his men to their home. The favorable wind propelled the heroes' ships close to home. After sighting Ithaca, Odysseus could see smoke from the chimneys. Relaxing for a moment, he entered the realm of Hypnos, the god of sleep, and started dozing. Odysseus's men were unhappy to return home with virtually no spoils of war. They envied Odysseus for having received a large bag from the gods. They wanted to know what kind of treasures were in the bag. They imagined it contained a lot of gold, so they opened the wineskin. After they opened the bag, all the winds rushed out, seeming furious. Odysseus awoke, startled by the great noise made by the strong winds. The winds caused huge waves and gathered storm clouds, pushing the ships far from home. Odysseus, feeling disillusioned and frustrated, thought of throwing himself into the sea and ending all that suffering, but eventually regained his composure. They returned to Aeolus's island seeking help, but they were driven away by the ruler. He would not disregard the will of the gods, who certainly did not wish Odysseus to return home. Odysseus and his men fought against the winds, which seemed to carry them further and further away from home. After a long time at sea, they found a new island. On it was a protected area where almost all of Odysseus's ships could find shelter. Only the hero's ship was moored outside the bay, as there was no more room. Odysseus ordered 2 men to inspect the island and find out who its inhabitants were. They found a child who was larger than a normal adult and asked him to take them to his ruler. They were taken to a large house where a giant queen welcomed them. The queen called her husband, who was huge and had a menacing appearance. He grabbed one of Odysseus's men and devoured him immediately. His companion escaped and ran to the ships. Meanwhile, the king of the giants, known as the Laestrygonians, called the others to hunt the small men. The giants attacked the men and their ships in the bay as they tried to escape. The giants grabbed the men and sank their ships, throwing huge stones. The men who were not devoured immediately ended up trapped to be eaten later. By failing to dock in the bay, only Odysseus's ship escaped the massacre. His fleet now consisted of only 1 ship. Everyone in it mourned the loss of the brave friends who had survived the Trojan War, but perished before terrible creatures. Odysseus's entire fleet, which had sailed from Ithaca for Troy, had been destroyed in his attempt to return home after the war. Only Odysseus's lead ship escaped the tragedy. After a long time of sailing aimlessly on the sea, they found a beautiful island. But this did not gladden the hearts of the Ithacans, for they were traumatized by their last experiences on the island of the Cyclops and the Laestrygonians. The men set up camp on the beach, but the soldiers' low morale left them inactive and without the courage to explore the island. But Odysseus grabbed a bough and set off after prey for dinner. By the grace of the gods, Odysseus found a small deer. Using his exceptional marksmanship, he brought the animal down with a perfect shot. As he was returning to the beach with the animal's carcass on his back, he spotted a puff of smoke on the other side of the island. The men of Ithaca were overjoyed to see the king return with precious food. But these smiles quickly vanished when Odysseus ordered the formation of an expedition to find out who lived on that island. The hero did not wish to be responsible again for sending more men to their deaths. Therefore, the chosen ones would be selected by the gods through a lottery. The group of men led by Eurylochus went out to find who ruled the island. They found a beautiful palace, but the entrance was filled with wolves and lions, which terrified the men. But to the explorers' amazement, these creatures seemed as docile as pets. Suddenly, one of the men heard the singing of a woman coming from inside the palace. A beautiful woman was singing as she wove. She was Circe, daughter of Helios and Perse. She had an enchanting beauty. Circe stood up and welcomed her visitors, inviting them in. She asked the guests to share a magnificent feast with her. Odysseus's men enjoyed the splendid delicacies offered by the lady, while Circe filled their cups with a magic potion. Suddenly, one of the men tried to speak, and his throat emitted a horrendous, animalistic sound. The terrified visitors began to undergo a metamorphosis. A large snout started to appear on their faces, and their hands were replaced by split hooves. Circe had turned all the visitors into pigs, and with her staff, she led them into the pigsty. But as a precaution, Eurylochus had not entered the palace, suspecting a trap. He was an eyewitness to that grotesque scene. Eurylochus desperately told everything he witnessed to Odysseus, who promptly set out to rescue them. Eurylochus begged Odysseus not to go to Circe. He recommended that they leave that island immediately before they were all turned into pigs or worse.